managing stands that look like that, and that really is the basis of what I'm talking about. Then in this is using diverse biodiversity, perennial grass mixtures with the forbs and legumes in them as well, to produce the kind of milk that clients are looking for right now, what we think is the future. It seems the project right now seems to be to produce milk from these kind of forages. It's what consumers want, and it seems to be where the highest amount of nutrition is from. Then, just using cows to convert corn and soybeans into another type of food doesn't really seem like what society is looking for then. So that's kind of where I'm coming at in talking about this relationship between the pasture plants and nutrition then. And to start with, this first graph is Organic Valley Farms over a 10-year period. That x-axis is 10 years calendar time then. And on the y-axis is percent butterfat of the milk coming off of farms. And so every time you see a peak in that percent butterfat, that's January, midwinter, and all of those troughs are July then. So there's this cyclicity to the percent butterfat that exists in all cows then. But if we compare grazing cows, Organic Valley number cow, their percent butterfat to USDA averages, grazing cows have a greater drop in percent butterfat during the summertime, which is actually a problem because that's our most valuable product. That's where the real nutrition is in those summer produced fats coming from milk then. So how can we try to minimize this, get rations correct that will minimize this too, that incorporate the pasture. So that next picture there, we're dealing with something called milk fat depression. So in midsummer and even starting early in the spring, we get a drop in butterfat that's out of proportion to the changes in percent protein as well then. And it turns out they've figured out not all that long ago that it's an active process mediated by this compound called T10C12CLA, and it is related to the good form of CLA that consumers are looking for. But this one different variation isomer works as a signal actually at the level of DNA transcription of the enzymes that make butterfat in the udder, and actually turns out in adipose tissue as well to shut off fat production then. So that's how we get this milk fat depression. This is the same mechanism that happens in a confinement barn that is maybe feeding too much grain, has chopped their forages too short, and they can get the same problem. But if we turn the page here, grazing cows have a little bit extra challenge here. So this CLA is made from a raw material called linoleic acid, an unsaturated fat, in plants, in growing pasture plants. And that level of linoleic acid, just the raw material, is really high the more immature that plant is. As a concentration, as we let that plant mature a little bit more, we can lower the absolute amount of linoleic acid coming into the cow's rumen. So that's one way that grazing cows can be challenged on this. And then if we've got what kind of rumen environment, what kind of bacteria in the rumen we're encouraging, will change which one of these isomers is made then. If we've got a healthy rumen fermentation, the pH is right, spot on, we've got the right amount of fibers in there, then we get that good CLA being made. But if we get lower pH, we get bacteria that convert that linoleic acid into that fat depressing CLA then. So that's a lot of what is happening on pastures. You'll talk to dairy farmers, and they have come to expect that as soon as they turn their cows out onto pasture, their butterfat is going to crash then. And part of that is this heavy load of linoleic acid, this short, immature forage that doesn't really have quite enough fiber in it, and they've set up essentially an unhealthy rumen environment. Even though they're eating green grass and they're outside and standing in pasture, we still have got an unhealthy rumen environment there. So what can we do to try to mitigate some of that then? And this is where a little bit of understanding of what's going on in the plant physiology is helpful then. So I've got our classic sigmoid growth curve there, and early in the season, if we're grazing, say 6 inches or so, we end up with forages that have excessive protein, which can be a problem if they're in the rumen. They've got inadequate fiber levels, and they actually, I don't have it on there, but they have really high levels of linoleic acid as well. If we can just allow a little bit more maturity on those plants, which usually means a little bit longer rest period, we can change the amount of protein and fiber going into that rumen and set up a different fermentation there then. The problem is if we get into a chronic overgrazing situation, we end up with those early spring forages with excess protein, inadequate fiber all year long too then. So that's sort of the goal, is to try to hit that plant maturity and get the right kind of feed coming into the rumen then. And then as far as monitoring, we can't obviously see into the rumen, see what's going on then, but manure is a really super sensitive indicator of what's going on in the rumen. And when I was milking cows again back in the 90s, I thought that loose manure meant I had super quality feed, and I was doing everything right then. It was hard to scrape down the barn after milking then, but by golly, that was super good feed then. And if I'd known now known then what I know now, I would have changed how I put together those cows' rations, how I moved them onto pasture, and how I managed those swards afterwards too then. So loose manure is, if you've got consistent loose manure through most of the cows in the herd, you've got an issue with the overall ration that should be addressed then. And there's a number of different ways of doing it, of addressing it. You can decrease the amount of pasture in the ration and increase the amount of stored forages going into it. You can change amounts of grain, but really can think of it in terms of an overall ration problem then, and what the ingredients are. It's not just the way it's supposed to be then. So this middle picture of a normal rumen and a normal cow flop with an inch or two of height to it, that is achievable even on pasture then. So you may have times when it messes with you, but if you think of that pasture as part of the ingredient and what kind of pasture you're growing out there, you should be able to achieve normal cow flops and high producing, good conditioned cows then. And obviously we have the other extreme of over mature forages then. But monitoring and being critical of what you're seeing in the manure will go a long way towards getting a ration that'll keep butterfat up and keep production up as well then. And it's kind of a different approach to feeding cows. I know Les has done some nutrition work in the past, and we're really thinking about putting these rations together differently. Rather than relying on getting energy from starch, from grains, we really want to think about what's the digestibility of the fiber. How much energy can we get from the fiber of the plant itself then? So it is a different way of thinking for many people then. So this next graph, I know there's at least one person here familiar with it. I really love this graph. It just puts together the interaction between the cow and the plant perfectly then. And I've used it a lot then. Hopefully it's all right. Yeah, I suppose. But it really, there's a lot going on here. So early in the year we see that we've got these feeds with excessive protein, inadequate fiber then. So, we all kind of, you hear that and you think, oh yeah, I know that then. But to do something about it, to keep those early rations to, if you turn the cows out for an all-day grazing in early May, you're going to get loose manure and have problems with it. We do have the ability to change how much acreage we do allow for the cows, but also the time. You know, you could let cows out for an hour or two grazing and then bring them back in again. So we are supposedly in control of this situation, and there are some things we can do about it. And then you know, we move into flowering, and you can see the quality dropping off. There's some things we can do to manage that. But I think really importantly, after flowering, just how the physiology and the growth of that plant changes then. It maintains quality for a much longer period of time. This is when we can get into the longer rest periods, get that plant maturity where we want it at, and also not overgraze and stress those plants unduly then. So to really think about grazing early in the spring and later after flowering in different terms then. That consistent rest period all year long just will not work then. And then the other thing that I have talked about, you know, we tried to talk about maybe the height of the pasture when you turn in. It turns out to be, it's a good general guide then, but there's a lot of exceptions, and farmers like to bring up the exceptions when I mention that. So I've kind of gone more towards doing leaf counts on tillers then as a better indicator of where that plant is physiologically then. And this kind of comes from New Zealand. Australia, they use leaf counts on perennial ryegrass, and their 3 leaf is sort of their maximum then. They don't want to let those plants get beyond 3 leaves, but I think using 3 leaves for us can kind of be a minimum then. Our species can accumulate more than 3 leaves on a tiller and still be dairy quality feed. And we know at that point that plant can take a grazing then. And so we get that nice mix of dairy quality, digestible feed, along with preserving the health of that plant. And I had a series of pictures that I present of exceptions to, or why height doesn't really work, and the next one's a good example then. So both of these plants are physiologically in the same place then. The one is just in less fertile soil then. But they would both kind of do the same thing, but you can see there's quite a difference in height there. And then turning over these next pictures, I'm kind of talking about getting that transition from flowering to that vegetative state afterwards then. Those 2 plants at the top side by side are from the same pasture. They're orchard grass plants. I clipped them down, but the one on the left is flowering and the one on the right was not. It maybe had its seed heads grazed at an earlier grazing, but if you look at the base of that plant then, of each of those, just how many green vegetative tillers we get on the right side after we get past flowering then. And so getting past flowering as quickly as possible gives us more dairy quality feed for the rest of the year then. And you can see that out in the pastures around that time of year then. And this last picture here is something that a lot of our farmers have been doing more, and it seems to be gaining popularity. When we are in that flowering stage, we've got seed heads to deal with, pre-clipping those pastures rather than turning the cows into it and then clipping afterwards, laying it out in a windrow with a disc bine, hay bine, and allowing the cows to eat from there. They eat that feed a lot more efficiently. We kind of lay out and get more of those green leaves below the seed heads exposed. The cows just they do better, maintain production a little better through those couple of weeks until we get on the other side of flowering then. So I just wanted to bring that up, and this is allowed under organic regulations as long as we just cut it and leave it in the windrow. We don't move it, rake it, or do anything else to it. It's still considered grazing then. So anyway, that was kind of what I wanted to touch on then. Yeah. Yep, clipping before they go into graze then. So starting, you'd start after the first seed head emergence then. Maybe you have to do it for a couple weeks. And the other thing, you don't have to do it every day. If you've got a forecast that says 2 or 3 days of good weather, you could cut 2 or 3 days worth. and then just move your poly wire through those windrows as well then. So, and cows, they utilize that really well. I've been impressed when I've seen it on farms then, how well they just go out right to the windrow and just start working through it then. So yeah,
that's actually a way that some of our farmers manage pasture bloat. If they have heavy clover and it's going to tend to bloat, if they wilt it, cut it, wilt it, the cow has to eat the stem, has to eat the whole plant. When you get in a pasture bloat situation, it's when the paddocks are too big, cows can top grade and eat just the best parts of the legumes. That's when you get into trouble.
Yeah, yep, that's a great way. Yeah, Brian.
Rick, could you kind of talk about the fact that this nutrition stuff is good for dairy cows, but it's also good for beef cattle?
Yeah. So if you're
on beef cattle are just as good as milk fat.
Right. If you're trying to grass finish beef cattle, then you really need to think in terms like we are with the dairy cattle. Then that bad form of CLA inhibits the synthesis of fat in adipose cells as well. Then, in fact, you can apparently there at health food stores, some bodybuilders will try to get this in pill form and try to take it to stay lean. Then, but the common complaint is that you'll get plenty of frame on those animals you're trying to finish, but they just didn't put the finish on then. And I think that this is a large factor in that. Then they've been eating really good forage. I think if you went out into those and looked at those animals' manure, it might have been a little too on the loose side all summer long. You just didn't have quite the right rumen environment. And if you could have altered that slightly, they would have put more finish on, I think. And that's, in Wisconsin, we don't, most of the people that talk about grass finishing beef, they do a great job, but they're from Missouri and south. They've got a lot longer season to work with. We really, we got to get what we can while we can.
So you suggest putting out dry hay? Isn't that
if need be, yeah, just a little bit out there. Depending on, it could just be a matter of a few flakes put out there each time you moved them. Then it could make a tremendous difference. It has to be really palatable hay so that they eat it then, but they will, and it does make a difference. Just little bits. I know that last year we did this one of these presentations down in far southwestern Wisconsin on a farm that they were 100% pasture at the time, and their manure, what turned out to be, we had measured how much was out there for the cows, and it turned out that if we just assumed that there was 22% dry matter in the pasture samples we took, he was grossly underfeeding his cows then. But you looked at the cows and they beautiful condition, full rumens. That manure was that middle picture that I had then, a nice cow flop then. It turned out that when I dried it down and it was a titch over 30% dry matter. And there were those yellowed and dried leaves, because he'd had a longer rest period, were part of that ration now then. And just that little bit, again, it would have been the equivalent of, a little bit of hay then made all the difference in how that forage was digested then. So yeah, so little bits can make a big difference. That was the long answer to that. Yeah.
We play devil's advocate, okay?
Okay.
If the producer's goal is to get his cattle out of the barn in the springtime as quickly as they can, either because they're running out of feed or they just tired of dealing with the door, or they've got they want to set the grazing wedge. How do you convince them that it'd be better not to go out and graze that grass?
Yeah.
4 inches tall,
right.
5 inches tall, and delay. Which I think clipping it is a really great idea, because then you can, if you will, you can make. You're more flexible in your management. I don't want to say you can make management mistakes, but you can be a lot more flexible in your management when you know that once that grass has a little more maturity, you can clip it and get really good utilization of it. Because just what you say, the issue with grass gets really tall is that the utilization falls off just because of the irregular grazing.
Yeah. So the thing that's changed for us then and makes this argument easier to make now is the value that butterfat has. And so if we get milk fat depression, so right now in Organic Valley, butterfat is about up to like 44% of the total value of milk then. And so avoiding that is our argument now then. You'll get a lot of milk if you do that early turnout, but so that's what's helped us then. And that's what I'm hoping continues to help us avoid overgrazing too then as well then.
Yeah.
So, but that'd be my counter argument to that then. So
this graph, the very first one you showed, is that all members? I mean, is that
yeah. So each of those little lines is a region in the country, but that's the average of all of our farms. It's all 1,700 farms.
And do you have any farms where that don't follow that graph?
So the very best farms would only the drop that you're seeing on that graph is about 0.5%, and the very best ones would be 0.2 to 0.3%. That's what you would see.
Interestingly, Orange Dairyman had a graph just like this with the national PHI numbers, mostly confined conventional herds, the same cyclicity, but the built-in biological cyclicity of this fat, no matter how you manage the cows.
Okay.
So we're trying to make it smaller, but there's this underlying thing that nature has there that's gonna be pretty hard to break.
Yeah, we'll never get it to zero then. So. Yeah, and the other thing I didn't mention in this whole pasture thing too is heat stress too then. Heat stress obviously will have a huge effect on the pH of the rumen and change how things are digested as well then. So that's another, thing that pasture people have that we don't, or that confinement don't then.
On the sides of monitoring, Greg, you're talking about the consistency of manure, which is really big and really important. So you want to comment a little bit about milk urea nitrogen and
Yeah, although we got a curve thrown at us this year too. So you can, as milk urea nitrogen, there's sort of a normal range which people will argue about, but as we get out to the extremes, it's an indicator that again rumen fermentation is not right. Then we've got excessive protein or not enough energy, and we can use that as well as an indicator of what's going on in the rumen. And dairy farmers, they get that on every bulk tank load of milk then too. So it is a way to use to monitor that fermentation. So
you're reluctant to mention it.
What's that?
You're reluctant to mention a number.
Well, say 9 to 15 then would be a good range for our grazing farms. For the all grass fed farms, our grass milk farms, that the upper end of that range, we might allow it to float up to maybe 16, 17 as a max, but that would be kind of where we'd want to see it at then. This year was very weird with this early spring all across the country. Even the all grass fed herds were seeing MUNs below 5, and for a consistent period of time too. It was quite strange, and people have ideas but not total explanations of it. It does go against a lot of what we used to think that
The spring was so cold.
it was cold,
It
that
should be
those plants just were not growing the same in
Greg,
that.
see what Faye Benson doing. Cornell did quite a few tests, and they found out that crude protein was really low on top.
It was, okay.
Crude protein was limiting.
Yeah.
Which was quite unusual because usually we get those high MUNs early on.
Right.
And another interesting thing is that USDA scientists found that grasses were declining in crude protein, and they think there's a relationship with increased CO2. So they think climate change is related to this. That report got suppressed by the current administration. But it was really quite an alarming report because, especially in the human diet, rice crude protein levels were declining quite rapidly. It was a huge commodity for a lot of millions of people. So I wonder, we need to keep an eye on crude protein in forage and see if that changes over time with rising CO2 levels.
Yeah.
And Lindrose grass in the field, what's your shelf life on that? Because molding for a hay harvest, you leave it in the field, but
Yeah.
those cows gonna leave it alone if it goes bad quick?
Yeah, if it starts to heat in the windrow, yeah, they're not going to eat it very well then.
It's a
So
very short window of just.
Well, the other thing you say
Yeah.
windrow is, a lot of guys just lay it flat.
Yeah, yeah.
Windrow.
Yeah, wide
Just
swath.
lay it
It's
flat.
kind of
Go
dry.
wide swath.
You don't overcut, just like ready to eat almost, huh?
or you look at the weather too. If it's going to rain
Don't bother.
tonight, just cut one day's worth then. So yeah.
Does it matter how dry that gets? I mean, if you've got it 3 days and it's starting to dry, they'll still eat it.
They still eat it pretty darn well then. I mean, they may back off a little bit, but they still might. I mean, I've not done it myself to know for firsthand, but I've had lots of people say that even at 3 days, they just go out there and hit it really hard then.
It's still pretty washed up. It's not
It is, right.
It's not like making 10% feed and cutting it and expecting to eat it.
Yeah, yeah.
You're almost harvesting like it's ready to be made for hay.
It would be just about ready for hay then, yeah.
It's right before flower, so it's right at
Yeah,
the
so it's perfect.
not late season.
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, you'd be doing it in June, so yeah. June, July then, so yeah.